many moons ago, people got caught out by this a lot. A lot of people invested their life savings. A lot of people went bankrupt by going into local economies which had very few industries. And because they had very few industries, when an industry shut down in a tough economic period, they were completely wedged from what they had done. Welcome to the Urban Property Investor. I'm your host, Sam Saggers, here to help you crack the code of real estate wealth. Today's show, how not to get screwed by risk ratings. Yes, I've seen too many people put themselves in very vulnerable positions by not understanding how banks assess risk over real estate. They are lending the money, so quite often we have to play by their rules. And today I want to dig into risk ratings and why quite often it goes unseen by property investors who end up putting themselves in a very risky place, an illiquid place. Of course, real estate can be liquid or illiquid. So we're going to talk about that. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back, regulars. Play the program in double speed, get your life back. And of course, all the episodes I've done are lessons on real estate. So feel free to go back in time. If you're a newbie, we've got a few urban property investors going back in time doing every episode. So I don't know, I feel like we need to provide an award for listening to every episode. I don't know what that could be. Could it be a bottle of wine, a free book, a bottle of, I don't know, Ultra Zinc herbs? I've got Ultra Zinc herbs that I haven't consumed on my desk. Ultra Zinc, high strength. Tell you what, this household is into vitamins at the moment. There's a lot of vitamins around my house. My wife is becoming a vitamin junkie. So I don't know. I'm getting into it too. I feel good. But hey, risk ratings, why they can screw you. It's a big conversation. Let me explain risk ratings so you guys understand it. Perhaps you don't. A big part of my job is just simply, is that a word? Simply sharing tips on real estate. So what happens is real estate's a game of leverage, right? And of course, we have to borrow money to get into the marketplace. It's the beautiful thing about real estate. To be honest, if there was no leverage, you probably wouldn't see too much of a real estate marketplace. It's all designed about leverage. What is leverage? Well, leverage is simply borrowing money off the bank at a certain loan to value ratio. Let's say you wanted to borrow or buy a property worth $1 million. You've got 100 grand. You're going to borrow 900 to equate to $1 million. You would be borrowing at 90%. Obviously, you might have a great impression of a property. You might think it's the bee's knees. It fits your budget. You like it. You've seen it, you visited it, you've fallen in love with the property. But ultimately, you're just contributing 10% to this game called real estate. The other 90% is coming from a lender, a bank, a funder. And of course, what their impression of the property is or their opinion of the property absolutely matters. Now, this is where people get screwed because quite often the bank won't provide the buyer a risk assessment of the real estate. Quite often banks use valuers, and valuers get out and about and see multiple properties every single day. Valuers are basically the way most banks outsource their risk situation. Now, valuers are usually independent from the bank. And of course, most valuers work for valuation firms. And of course, valuation firms then carry risk insurance should the valuation be wrong. So quite often why you see a difference between market value and bank value is simply because you are using an independent third party who also has a risk assessment to do on a property and doesn't want the wrath of the banks coming back to bite them. So quite often we get valuation distortion between what a real estate agent thinks a property's worth, what buyers think a property's worth, to what a bank sees a property being worth by virtue of a pesky little creature known as the valuer. But the valuer's got a very important job to do for the bank. They have to assess the risk of the real estate. And they do that by doing a risk analysis on the property. Now, here's the thing. Most buyers do not get to see the valuation done on their real estate. They are simply buying something and assume everything's okay. And of course, most often it is, but there are occasions where the bank will still lend you money despite the risk on the actual asset being high. I mean, you would think if you were borrowing money and you were taking a loan from a bank, that they would ring you up and say, hey, we've looked at this property and we think it's very high risk. We don't want to lend you the money and we don't think you should buy the property. You would think that is a good idea, but no, banks are happy to lend money on risky assets, which is kind of mind-blowing and one of the craziest parts of this thing called real estate. This is how, things like the GFC have unfolded. In the GFC, they took risky human beings with no credit history and just lent them money. So banks love getting money out the door. It's really, they've got certain quotas to meet and they will happily lend money on a very risky asset. So how does a valuer assess risk? Well, there are 8 sections to how they report risk to the bank. The first one is location and neighborhood. And of course, location and neighborhood is pretty simple. It's basically a summary of whether you're buying in a good pocket of a location and the neighborhood is safe and sound. And of course, when valuers assess risk, they will score the risk out of lowest 1 and highest 5. And in the middle, you have 3. So 3 is effectively the mid-range risk and very, very normal. Most properties will score a 3 because the valuer is also kind of protecting themselves. Now, hang on one sec. I've just got to send a text. I've got a deal going on right now. It's live. All right, done. Texted. So risk ratings are scored out of 1 being the lowest, 2 being the second lowest, 3 being middle range, 4 being on the higher side of risk, and 5 being ultimately very, very risky. So, location and neighborhood is probably the first part of the puzzle. And so a bank will basically assess that location and neighborhood. Now, if you have bought in a regional town or a small, sort of really, really small town, sort of like under 10,000 people, you're going to have a pretty terrible location and neighborhood score. And this is what can happen in a booming marketplace. People buy in some pretty speculative places because they just want to get into the market. They want to be part of something, part of the real estate community, part of the investment community. And sometimes the yields in small towns are basically pretty good. And of course, what happens is the bank doesn't tell you that the score for that location and neighborhood is very, very low. Very, very low. And of course, for property investors, they don't know. So they buy these assets. And of course, where things go wrong is in a downturn. And I'll explain what can happen to a risk rating variable during a downturn. The next risk analysis a valuer will report to the bank is the land. Now, the land, for the most part, is usually a low risk dynamic for a lender. But risk ratings can climb up if the land is irregular, if the land is a massive, massive slope. If it's a goat track, you're going to get a high risk assessment, because should the building, get, challenged, it's going to be very, very hard to rebuild on that land. So land, of course, if it has a title, will have a lower risk assessment than if the land itself is being valued and a title doesn't exist. So again, land is pretty straightforward for the most part. It's basically any impositions on the land. Now, but the land can have challenges. It can have right-of-ways. It can have easements. It can have encumbrances on it. And of course, if the land is affected, it's going to have a higher risk rating. Then there's the risk assessment on environmental issues. And of course, as we know, there are just so many environmental issues these days. And of course, environmental issues can rear up as time goes on. And of course, we know that today certain suburbs, certain marketplaces are just considered very, very high risk from an environmental proposition. And of course, you can go to far north Queensland and get very low environmental or very high environmental risk analysis. You can go to river areas which are affected by flood. And again, it's the valuer's job to report this to the bank. And again, for a lot of people, they don't know they're in a flood zone. The bank doesn't ring them and say, by the way, what we're going to do is lend you money, and we're going to lend you money in a flood zone. And I'll explain how they do this trickery. This trickery can come back to affect you. And then finally, in really the property risk section is improvements. Is the property run down? Is it termite infected? Is it got asbestos? Is the layout dysfunctional? Is the improvement basically past its use by date? Is the improvement in line with the market? And of course, again, banks won't ring you and tell you you've got a problem with your improvements. So you would think as a consumer, you would be protected by borrowing money off someone who is effectively providing a good, but it doesn't work that way. That's why you can get screwed over by really the not understanding bank risk ratings. So again, the bank will use the valuer to assess market risks and the ratings of that. So the first one that they will assess is recent market direction. So what happens is when the market's booming, and let's say it's going up more than 5% per annum, which is really the long-term average, then all of a sudden you start to get this situation where the valuer will report to the bank that the recent market direction is becoming volatile because the market is moving too quickly. Equally, if the market is going down in value, the valuer will report to the bank that it's a volatile marketplace. Things are seesawing up and down. Now, most banks have pretty formidable information on where they see the market headed. But again, a bank will lend you money even if the market's going down. So they might know, and their forecast may be that the market is going to go down 10, 15%, which can happen. They're still going to lend you money. They're still going to lend you money. They're going to ring you and go, hey, we just saw the valuers report. The market is going to go down by 10% in that particular zone you're potentially buying in. We see it as a volatile marketplace. You're buying at the top of the market. Don't do it. Get out of the contract. Bank's not going to call you to do that, but they will assess it, but they won't call you. So market volatility is part of the valuer's job to assess. And that market volatility is really what kind of sales are being made. Are they seeing discounts happen? Is the market behaving abnormally? And again, where a valuer might protect themselves is they might lower the price based on their opinion of market volatility. They might go, well, we see the market dropping by 5%, so we will value the property lower than the purchase price by 5%. So valuer might protect the bank's interests by basically reporting on market volatility. Remember, the valuation's not to protect you, it's to protect the bank. It's basically when you might pay for it, which is the really ironical part, you might be slugged a $500 valuation fee, but the assessment is for the bank, not for you. And again, it will link to what you're doing from a leverage perspective, but it's not meant for your eyes. And, a big part of my job as a professional negotiator is to try and get my hands on the valuation to see where the risk analysis is on the real estate. And of course, the next one is local economy impact. Now, if you're buying in a metro area, this is usually never a massive problem. But if you're buying in a regional town, and again, the local economy impact is a single industry town, you might want the bank to ring you and go, hey, buddy, you realize the only thing going on in this particular township is an abattoir. If that was to close down, there's going to be a seismic shift in the local economy, and it will impact the value of your real estate. Would you like to just abort your particulars? Would you like to abort buying? No, they're not going to call you. Now, many, many moons ago, people got caught out by this a lot. A lot of people invested their life savings. A lot of people went bankrupt by going into local economies which had very few industries. And because they had very few industries, when an industry shut down in a tough economic period, they were completely wedged from what they had done and could not get out of their assets and basically went negative equity. And the final risk analysis that a valuer will work on for a bank is the market segment. Now, the market segment's pretty straightforward. Are there multiple 3-bedroom houses being sold in a suburb? Are there multiple 4-bedroom houses being sold in a suburb? Is there a lack of evidence of studio apartments being sold in a suburb? Is there a lack of resales for over 55s retirement homes? So quite often you'll see really high risk ratings on market segment if there is no market segment. And of course, if you're a pioneer in real estate, you tend to get burnt. You tend to get very, very burnt. So you don't want to be a pioneer in real estate. You don't want to be the first into a small town which has a local economy impact and buying an apartment that's never existed before in that small town. That's going to get high risk ratings on it. So how do the banks screw you? This is the conversation. So now we know what happens if we think about it logically. If we just buy in a normal suburb, which is a proven place, it's going to have a pretty good location and neighborhood score. If it's a normal, just land, it's not a goat track, it's not, it's a normal parcel of land, you're going to have a pretty safe experience from investment. If you're not buying next to a flood zone, you're not going to have an environmental issue. If the improvements of the property are sound, they're stable, there's no hazardous materials, it's just a good solid structure, it's got plenty of years of life left, you're not going to have a problem from risk. If you are buying in a marketplace and just, applying a good buying strategy with the market direction, you're not going to really have a risk. Most, deals are pretty straightforward. If you're buying in a multiple industry area, you're not going to have a risk. If you're buying in an area where it's common to have 3-bedroom houses, you're not going to have a risk. And of course, if there's sales reoccurring from a market volatility perspective, you won't have much risk. However, the polar opposite can be said when the location, land, environment, improvements, market direction, market volatility, local economy, and the market segment is haywire. And again, the bank doesn't tell you not to do it. So you could go to a small and quite often volatile area and you will get lent money on leverage. And you apply that leverage into the market, and then it's not until really a downturn comes along that this stuff becomes a problem. Now, let me backtrack a bit. When you're borrowing money, quite often for a lot of investors, they use the same bank. And it's a bit of a no-no, particularly based on risk assessment. What happens is the banks have a clause called an all monies clause. And it basically means that they can manipulate your loan to value ratio. So if the valuer reports to the bank that you've got 3 5s, which is, remember, 1 is the lowest, 5 is the highest. Let's say the valuer reports to the bank, they're concerned about the local economy impact, they're concerned about the location and neighborhood, and they're concerned about the improvements. They're going to score it a 5. So all of a sudden the bank goes, wow, this is a pretty risky property. Do we really want to lend 85, 90% of the value of this real estate? The probable answer is no, they would not. However, for a lot of people that buy real estate and invest in real estate, they're taking equity out of their own home and they're using the same bank to rebuy an investment property. The bank simply then looks at how much equity the intended investor has in their home and goes, you know what, their home is not so risky, their investment is risky. Let's still lend them at 90%, but let's invoke the all monies clause. And really what we'll do is we'll lend them at 70 or 80% of the property's value. And if the property goes down, we will essentially take equity out of the intended investor's family home. So we will lock in the problem by lending them a risky asset or lending them on a risky asset by actually clawing money out of their own PPR. And this happens all the time. This is why so many people will say, don't cross-securitize your family home with your property investments. Now, again, the riskier the investment, the more the bank will cross you up. Now, the other thing that can happen with risk ratings is you might get a low risk rating and you might borrow 90%. The bank might go, no worries. We actually got a report from the valuer. Everything's honky-dory with the property. But particularly in smaller towns, you might then see a change in transformation, a change in activities. The market may all of a sudden not like regional Australia. And so the market segment condition can drop really, really quickly, or the market volatility rather can drop really, really quickly. In other words, it's taking a year to sell a property. And so what can happen is those risk ratings can increase rapidly at really the valuer's discretion. And so for property investors, they can put themselves in a position where they own a very volatile asset, which one day when they want to use equity from, or they want to resell, there is no marketplace that can actually borrow at a high loan to valuation ratio to get the asset off you. One day you either have to refinance your asset or resell your property. Now, if your risk rating changes during your ownership, it's going to be harder to pull equity out of your property. If your risk rating increases during your ownership and you're trying to sell the property, it's harder for the next person to borrow money to buy the real estate if they're not cross-securitized. And so these are the challenges with real estate and, of course, how risk is assessed on real estate. The safest way to play the game, by the way, is just to stick to the fundamentals. PI, population, infrastructure, and employment. Where are the jobs? Where is the infrastructure spend? And where are the people? And, of course, this is always why I come back to pretty straightforward logic, which is, your Sydneys, your Melbournes, your Brisbanes, your Adelaides, your Perths, your Geelongs, your Newcastles, your Toowoomba's. They're bigger places by Australian standards. And of course, carry far less risk when it comes to your retirement. Volatility of risk is much, much lower. So banks will screw you. They will not ring you and tell you you're buying a absolute dud. They will just change the way they assess the assessment on the loan. And they quite often do that, particularly if you're cross-securitized. Now, there will be occasions where valuers get it wrong. They're human. It's a human report. There are occasions where valuers just are time poor. They're being asked to do 15, 20, 25 valuations a day and can get assessments wrong. So, but for the most part, if you consider risk, just consider that the riskier the area, dwelling, environment, and local economy you're headed towards, the tougher it's going to be on your back pocket. And again, a lot of it can come down to affecting the price of your property. Proximity to amenities, size, layout of the property, market conditions, supply metrics, economic factors, and really local zoning all have an impact on really what you're buying. And of course, the banks do not pass this information on. All right, folks, thanks for tuning in to the show, and we'll play more episodes real soon. Take care, and bye for now. Thanks for tuning in to the Urban Property Investor. To never miss an episode, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app or on YouTube. I would love it if you could give the show a rating and share it with your friends and family. In between episodes, you can always keep in touch with me by connecting on social media over Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Until we meet again on the next episode of the Urban Property Investor, take care and bye for now.